John had always loved his little house at the end of Maplewood Lane. It was a quiet street in a small town where everyone knew each other's names. The trees around his home were tall and thick, like they were guarding him from the outside world. For John, his house was more than just a building. It was a place of peace, a place where he could be himself. After a long day of work, he would sit on his porch with a cup of tea and watch the sun go down behind the trees. John was a simple man. He liked routine, quiet moments, and the feel of soil in his hands. He had a small garden where he grew tomatoes, beans, and sunflowers. Sometimes, neighborhood kids would come by, curious about how plants grew. John was happy to share his knowledge and a little harvest. But lately, things were not so peaceful. There had been rumors around the neighborhood about the Homeowners Association, the HOA. They were a group of people who made rules about what neighbors could do with their homes and yards. John had always found the HOA a little too strict, but he never thought they would come to his door in person. Especially not to check the exact lines of his property. One bright afternoon, John was watering his sunflowers when he noticed two men walking down the lane. They looked official, dressed in light blue shirts with badges hanging from their necks. They carried clipboards and small tools. John's heart beat a little faster. These were the surveyors he had heard about. The two men reached the edge of John's land. Without knocking or asking, they stepped onto his property. They moved carefully, measuring and marking the ground. John felt a mix of anger and worry. He had never given anyone permission to come here. He walked toward them, wiping dirt from his hands on his pants. His old dog, Max, followed close behind, growling softly. John's eyes were steady, watching the men carefully. "Excuse me," John said in a calm but firm voice. "Who gave you permission to come on my land?" One of the surveyors looked up quickly. "Sir, we're here to do a survey. The HOA sent us to check the property lines." John took a deep breath. He knew this moment would come, but he didn't expect them to be so bold. "I didn't say you could come here. This land belongs to me." The men glanced at each other, clearly unsure what to do next. John reached behind the door of his porch and pulled out an old shotgun that had been there for years. It was not loaded to harm but kept for protection and to scare off anyone with bad intentions. The shotgun was worn, with scratches and dents, but it meant something. It told the visitors that John was serious about his home. The two surveyors stepped back, their faces showing surprise and a little fear. We just need to finish the work," one said nervously. John's voice was steady. "If you want to work here, you will ask me first. Otherwise, you can leave now." The men nodded quickly and started to walk away, their clipboards clutched tightly. John watched them retreat, his dog still growling softly. After they left, John sat down on his porch steps and looked out at the land. It was more than just property to him. It was part of his family's history, a place where he had buried memories and dreams. He knew the HOA didn't understand that. They only saw numbers and lines on a map. John felt a strong mix of sadness and pride. He was proud to stand up for what was his, but he was sad that his peaceful life was being disturbed. Later that evening, John called his old friend, Henry, who lived 2 streets over. Henry had lived in the neighborhood for many years and knew about the HOA better than anyone. "Henry, they sent surveyors onto my land today," John said over the phone, his voice low but serious. "They left when I showed them the shotgun, but I don't know what they're planning." Henry was silent for a moment before replying, "John, the HOA is trying to take control. They want to make sure no one breaks their rules, but sometimes they push too far. You did the right thing standing your ground. Just be careful. John hung up, feeling a little better but still worried. He looked around his garden, the sunflowers swaying gently in the breeze. This was his home, and he would protect it no matter what. That night, as the wind whispered through the trees, John made a decision. He would not let anyone come onto his land without his permission. He would stand strong and face whatever came next. Because some things were worth fighting for: the peace, the memories, and the feeling of home. The next morning, John woke up early, as he always did. The sunlight peeked through the curtains, and the familiar sounds of birds filled the air. But today, his mind was restless. The visit from the surveyors had left him uneasy. What if they came back? What if the HOA tried to take more of his land? The thought made his chest tighten. John went outside and looked at the boundary markers the surveyors had left. Small orange flags stuck in the ground, marking lines he had never seen before. They didn't seem right. John knew his land well: every tree, every rock, every inch of soil. These markers didn't belong there. He decided to take a walk around his property, checking the lines carefully. The sun warmed his back as he walked slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Max, his loyal dog, followed closely, sniffing the ground with curiosity. John stopped by the old oak tree near the edge of his yard. This tree had stood for over 50 years, its wide branches spreading like arms. It was a place where John's children had played when they were young. It was more than just a tree, it was a symbol of his family's roots. Looking at the flags, John felt a spark of determination. He couldn't let anyone steal this land, not without a fight. But he also knew he needed help. The HOA was powerful and had money. John was just one man. That afternoon, John drove into town to visit the local library. He wanted to find the old maps of the neighborhood, maps that showed the real property lines before the HOA had taken control. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Thompson, helped him search through dusty files and old books. After hours of digging, John found what he was looking for: a faded map from the 1970s showing the exact boundaries of his property. He compared it to the surveyor's flags and saw the difference clearly. The HOA was trying to take a small but important piece of his land. John felt a mix of anger and hope. He had proof now. But he also knew that having proof was only the first step. Back home, John sat down at his kitchen table and made a plan. He would write a letter to the HOA, explaining that their surveyors had trespassed on his land without permission. He would include a copy of the old map as evidence. But more than that, John wanted to talk to his neighbors. Maybe they had seen things, or maybe they had been bothered by the HOA's strict rules too. John believed that if the neighbors stood together, they could make a difference. The next day, John started walking around the neighborhood, knocking on doors. At the first house, an elderly woman named Mrs. Brown answered. "Good morning, Mrs. Brown," John said politely. "I wanted to talk to you about the HOA. They've been sending surveyors onto my land, and I'm worried about what they're trying to do." Mrs. Brown sighed. "Oh, John, you're not the only one. They're always coming up with new rules. Last month, they told me I couldn't plant flowers outside my fence. It's like they want to control everything." John nodded. "I think it's time we talk to them together. We need to stand up for our homes." Over the next few days, John visited more neighbors. Some were upset like Mrs. Brown, but others were too afraid to speak up. The HOA had made it clear that they didn't like to be challenged. One afternoon, John met with a man named David, who lived 2 houses down. David was quiet but wise. He worked as a mechanic and knew a lot about the town's history. "I've seen the HOA push people around before," David said. "They want to keep control by fear. But if we stick together, they can't ignore us." John felt encouraged. He wasn't alone. The neighborhood had strength in numbers. That evening, John typed up his letter to the HOA. He wrote clearly and politely but firmly. He explained what had happened, attached the map, and asked them to stop sending surveyors without his permission. John took a deep breath and mailed the letter. Then, he waited. The days passed slowly. John continued his routine but kept a close eye on the boundaries of his land. He felt the weight of the fight ahead, but he also felt a new sense of hope. The quiet fight had begun. One night, as John sat on his porch watching the stars, Max lay at his feet. John thought about his family, his memories, and the land that held them all. He knew this was more than just a battle over property lines. It was a battle for respect, for peace, and for the simple joy of calling a place home. And John was ready. John felt the tension in the neighborhood growing with each passing day. The HOA's presence was like a shadow over Maplewood Lane. More neighbors were complaining quietly about unfair rules, but few dared to speak up. John's visit to so many houses had planted a seed of hope, but now it was time for something bigger. One evening, John decided to call a neighborhood meeting. He wanted everyone to come together and talk openly about the problems with the HOA. He wasn't sure how many people would show up, but he knew it was important to try. John printed simple flyers and handed them out as he walked the street. The flyers read, "Neighborhood Meeting, Maplewood Community Hall this Saturday 6 p.m. Let's talk about the HOA and our homes." On Saturday evening, John arrived early at the community hall. It was a small, old building with wooden floors and big windows. He set up chairs and placed a stack of copies of the old property map on the table. One by one, neighbors began to arrive. Mrs. Brown, who had shared her story about the flower rules, took a seat near the front. David came in with a friendly nod. Even some neighbors who had seemed quiet before were there, looking curious. John stood in front of the room and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We all know the HOA has been strict lately. They've sent surveyors onto my land without permission, and many of you have stories too. I think it's time we stand together." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. John held up the old map. "This map shows the real boundaries of my property. The HOA surveyors marked lines that don't match. If they take control of our land, it will change how we live here." Mrs. Brown raised her hand. "They told me I couldn't fix my fence without permission. When I asked why, they said the fence didn't meet their standards. But it was the same fence for 10 years. Another neighbor, a young woman named Lisa, spoke up. "I was fined because of my garden. They said it wasn't neat enough. But gardening is my hobby. I want to enjoy my home." The room was alive with stories. People shared their frustrations, fears, and hopes. John listened carefully and nodded. He saw that many neighbors felt the same, like they were losing control over their own homes. After a while, John stood again. "We have a choice. We can let the HOA decide everything, or we can work together to protect our rights. I suggest we write a letter as a group, showing that we don't agree with their actions." David spoke next. "I agree. We should also ask for a meeting with the HOA board. They need to hear from all of us." The neighbors nodded. A plan was forming. After the meeting, John felt a lightness he hadn't felt in days. The community was waking up. They were no longer just neighbors, they were a team. Over the next week, John and several others worked on the letter. They included stories, the old maps, and a clear message: the HOA needed to respect the residents and follow the real property lines. They collected signatures from nearly every household on Maplewood Lane. Even those who had been afraid to speak now added their names. John mailed the letter to the HOA office, addressed to the board members. A few days later, John received a reply. The letter was polite but firm. The HOA agreed to meet with a group of residents at the community hall in 2 weeks. John shared the news with his neighbors. The meeting would be a chance to speak directly with those in charge. As the date grew closer, John felt nervous but hopeful. He prepared notes, practiced what he wanted to say, and talked with others about their concerns. The night before the meeting, John sat on his porch with Max, looking at the stars. He thought about how far they had come, from a quiet man protecting his land with a shotgun to a group of neighbors ready to stand up for their homes. He knew the fight was not over, but something important had started. The voices of Maplewood Lane were growing stronger. The next morning, John checked the boundary markers again. The orange flags were still there, but now they felt different. They were no longer just a threat, they were a reason to unite. John smiled quietly. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The day of the big meeting finally arrived. The community hall buzzed with quiet chatter as neighbors filed in. Everyone seemed nervous but determined. John arrived early, carrying his old property map and copies of the letter they had sent to the HOA. He took a deep breath and looked around the room filled with familiar faces, some worried, some hopeful. At exactly 7 p.m., the door opened, and the HOA board members entered. They wore formal clothes and carried thick folders. The room fell silent as the two groups faced each other, the residents on one side, and the board members on the other. The chairman of the HOA, a man named Mr. Wilson, spoke first. "Thank you for coming. We received your letter and understand your concerns. We are here to listen." John stepped forward, feeling the weight of the room on his shoulders. "We appreciate that," he said clearly. "But we want to be honest. Many of us feel the HOA has been unfair and heavy-handed. Your surveyors came onto my land without permission. You marked boundaries that don't match the true property lines. This has caused a lot of worry." Mr. Wilson nodded, flipping through papers. "Our job is to protect the neighborhood's appearance and value. We have rules everyone agreed to when they moved here." Mrs. Brown, sitting nearby, raised her hand. "But some of these rules don't make sense. I was fined for planting flowers outside my fence. It made no difference to anyone, but it made me feel like I couldn't enjoy my own yard." Lisa, the young woman from the earlier meeting, spoke up too. "I was fined for my garden's appearance. I just want to live peacefully and enjoy my home." The room filled with murmurs of agreement. John looked at the board members. "We want to work with the HOA. We want to follow reasonable rules. But we need respect and fairness. We want you to honor the true property lines and stop sending people onto our land without permission." The chairman paused, then said, "We understand your points. We will review the property lines again and communicate better. We don't want to create problems." One of the board members, Mrs. Clark, added, "We will hold open meetings more often and make sure residents can ask questions." The room felt lighter. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. After the meeting, neighbors gathered outside the hall. People talked quietly, smiling for the first time in weeks. David put his arm around John's shoulder. "You did good, John. You brought us together. John nodded, feeling proud but tired. We still have work to do, but we're stronger now. Over the next few days, the community worked to keep the spirit alive. They formed a small neighborhood committee to watch over the HOA's actions and make sure residents' voices were heard. John was chosen as the leader, not because he wanted power, but because people trusted him. One morning, John received a letter from the HOA. It included new, official property maps that matched the old ones John had found. The HOA promised not to send surveyors without permission and to respect residents' rights. John shared the news at a neighborhood barbecue. Families gathered in backyards, children played, and neighbors talked freely. The barbecue was more than a party, it was a celebration of community and hope. Mrs. Brown brought her famous apple pie, and Lisa shared fresh vegetables from her garden. John smiled as he watched everyone enjoying themselves. The fight wasn't over, but they had made a difference. Still, John knew there were challenges ahead. Some HOA members might resist the changes. Some neighbors might lose hope. But the spirit of Maplewood Lane was stronger now. One evening, John stood by the old oak tree, looking at the land he had fought to protect. Max rested at his feet, wagging his tail. John thought about the long journey from fear and anger to courage and unity. He felt grateful for the neighbors who stood with him, for the community that refused to be silenced. "This is home," John whispered. "And we will protect it together." Life on Maplewood Lane had changed in small but important ways. The tension with the HOA had eased, and neighbors were beginning to trust each other again. The neighborhood committee that John led worked hard to keep communication open. Monthly meetings became a place for neighbors to share ideas, voice concerns, and find solutions together. John felt proud of how far they had come. The fights and fear that once filled the air had given way to hope and community spirit. But just when John thought things might finally settle, a new challenge appeared. One afternoon, as John was working in his garden, a letter arrived from the HOA. The envelope looked official, and John's heart skipped a beat as he opened it. The letter explained that the HOA planned to install new street lights along Maplewood Lane. They said the lights would improve safety and make the neighborhood look nicer. John frowned as he read. He knew the street was already well lit by the moon and porch lights, and he worried about the cost. Many neighbors had fixed incomes and couldn't afford more fees. What bothered him more was that the letter said the project would begin soon, without asking the residents first. John decided to call a meeting with the neighborhood committee. He invited Mrs. Brown, David, Lisa, and a few others who had been active in the fight against the surveyors. At John's house, they gathered around the kitchen table. John held up the letter. "This new plan worries me. They want to start building street lights soon, but they didn't ask us. We need to think about what this means for all of us." Mrs. Brown nodded slowly. "More fees, probably. We don't know how much it will cost, or if everyone agrees." David frowned. "I like the idea of safety, but it should be our decision. We live here. We should have a say." Lisa added, "And what about the trees? Will the lights hurt them? We love our green neighborhood." John listened carefully. "I think we should write back to the HOA and ask for a community vote. We need clear answers about the cost and impact before anything starts." The group agreed to help John write a letter. Together, they drafted a respectful but firm message asking the HOA to delay the project until residents had a chance to vote and discuss. Over the next week, John and the committee went door to door, explaining the situation to neighbors. Some were upset, others had not even heard about the street light plan. At the next neighborhood meeting, the hall was full again. John read the letter they planned to send, and many neighbors signed it. There was energy in the room, a reminder that their voices mattered. John mailed the letter to the HOA and waited. Days passed, and John wondered how the HOA would respond. Then, one morning, a man named Mr. Lee arrived at John's door. Mr. Lee was a new member of the HOA board, young and polite. "I'm here to talk about the street light project," Mr. Lee said. "The board heard your concerns, and they want to hold a community meeting before making any decisions." John nodded. "That's what we wanted. We want to work together, not fight." Mr. Lee smiled. "Good. The meeting will be next Thursday at the community hall. We hope many residents will come." John felt relief but knew the meeting would be important. He spoke with neighbors, encouraging them to attend and speak up. On the night of the meeting, the community hall was packed. People brought questions, ideas, and concerns. Mr. Lee and other board members listened carefully. John stood to speak. "We want safety and beauty in our neighborhood. But we also want to protect our community's voice and budget. Let's find a way that works for everyone." After hours of discussion, the HOA agreed to slow the project and create a committee with residents to plan the streetlights carefully. They promised transparency and respect for the community's wishes. As the meeting ended, neighbors applauded. John looked around and saw hope shining in their eyes. The fight for their homes wasn't over, but Maplewood Lane had grown stronger. Together, they could face new challenges, protect their land, and build a future they all believed in. John smiled, feeling grateful for the quiet power of neighbors united. The peaceful days on Maplewood Lane felt like a fresh breeze after months of worry and conflict. John believed the neighborhood was finally healing. The new committee, formed to plan the street light project, worked carefully with the HOA. They promised transparency, and John trusted the board was keeping its word. But trust, John soon learned, was not something given lightly. One crisp morning, as John trimmed his sunflowers, he noticed a small group of workers arriving near the edge of his property. They carried poles and tools, moving quickly toward the street. John's heart sank. Without waiting, he went outside, calling to the workers. "Hey! What are you doing here?" One man turned, wiping sweat from his brow. "We're here to install streetlights. The HOA said to start today." John frowned. "Wait a minute. I thought there was a committee working on the plan. Didn't the HOA say they would wait for us?" The worker shrugged. "I don't know. We just got the orders." John's hands clenched. This wasn't right. He called Max, his dog, and walked toward the workers, steady but firm. "I want you to stop work immediately. We didn't agree to this." The workers looked unsure but began packing their tools. John stayed there, watching until the last one left. Later, John called the HOA office. After waiting on hold, a woman answered. "This is John from Maplewood Lane," he said. "Some workers started installing streetlights on my property line without permission. What's going on?" The woman's voice was calm but firm. "The HOA thought the project was approved by the committee. We're sorry if there was confusion. We'll look into it." John felt a knot in his stomach. It was the kind of mistake that could ruin the trust they had worked so hard to build. That evening, John met with the neighborhood committee. Everyone was upset but ready to act. "We need clear rules," said Mrs. Brown. "No more surprises," David added, "and we need a better way to communicate with the HOA. This can't happen again." John nodded. "Agreed. I will request a meeting with the HOA board to discuss these problems." We have to protect our community. The committee worked together to draft a letter, asking the HOA for better communication and respect for the neighborhood's decisions. They wanted promises in writing, so there would be no more confusion. Meanwhile, John continued to watch over his land carefully. He marked his property lines clearly with bright flags and small signs. It was a quiet way to remind others, this was his home, and he would protect it. One afternoon, John received a call from Mr. Lee, the young HOA board member who had shown respect before. "John, I want to apologize for the confusion about the street lights," Mr. Lee said sincerely. "We made a mistake. The board is working on a plan to improve how we communicate and get approval from residents." John appreciated the call but knew words were not enough. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Lee. We're ready to work with you, but we need action, not just promises." Mr. Lee agreed, promising a formal meeting to address the issues. A few days later, the HOA called a special meeting at the community hall. John and the committee prepared carefully. They wanted to make sure this time, their voices would be heard loud and clear. At the meeting, John spoke first. "We all want a strong neighborhood. But trust must be earned. Clear rules and respect for our decisions are not just requests, they are needs." Mr. Wilson, the HOA chairman, listened attentively. "We hear you, John. We want to improve and rebuild trust. We will create written policies and make meetings open to everyone." The room felt hopeful but cautious. The promise of change was there, but only time would tell if it would last. As the meeting ended, neighbors talked quietly but with a new energy. John felt a deep sense of responsibility. He wasn't just protecting his land anymore, he was helping protect the spirit of the entire community. That night, as John sat by the old oak tree with Max, he thought about the journey so far. The fight for his land had turned into something bigger, a fight for respect, fairness, and trust. John smiled softly. "We've come far, Max. And we're not giving up." Max wagged his tail, as if agreeing. The road ahead would have challenges, but John knew one thing for sure: together, the neighbors of Maplewood Lane would face them head-on. The months that followed felt like a fresh start for the people of Maplewood Lane. The HOA, after months of meetings, letters, and honest talks, had changed. The board began to listen more and make decisions with the community in mind. John felt a deep sense of peace as he walked down the street one sunny afternoon. Neighbors greeted each other with smiles, children played freely, and the old oak tree standing tall at the edge of John's yard seemed to watch over them all. The neighborhood committee continued its work, making sure the HOA kept its promises. John, now respected as a leader, felt proud but humble. He knew that protecting a home was about more than fences or maps. It was about people, trust, and care. One morning, John received a letter from the HOA. This time, it was different, friendly, hopeful, and full of good news. The board was planning a community day to celebrate the neighborhood's spirit and new beginning. John shared the letter with the neighbors, and soon the entire street was buzzing with excitement. Families planned picnics, games were organized for children, and everyone promised to come together. On the day of the celebration, the community hall and surrounding park were filled with laughter, music, and delicious food. Mrs. Brown's apple pies were a hit, and Lisa's garden vegetables were shared generously. John stood by the oak tree, watching children play and neighbors talk. David came over and clapped him on the back. "Look at this, John. We did it." John smiled. "Yes, we did. Together." Later, Mr. Lee, the young HOA board member, approached John. Thank you for sticking with us through the hard times. We couldn't have done this without your leadership. John shook his hand warmly. Thank you for listening. That made all the difference. As the sun began to set, John felt a gentle breeze rustle the leaves of the old oak tree. It was a reminder of time passing, of roots growing deep and strong. John thought about the long journey from the first surveyor's flag on his land, to the meetings, the fights, the letters, and finally, the peace. He knew that challenges would come again in life, but the spirit of Maplewood Lane was ready. Neighbors had learned that strength comes from standing together, from listening, and from respect. John looked at Max, who rested quietly at his feet, and whispered, "This is home, Max. And it always will be." The future was bright, filled with hope, friendship, and the promise of new beginnings. And for John and his neighbors, that was more than enough.